All right, hi everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our SMA UK MOD speaker session entitled How to Make Alliances Succeed Across Multiple Dimensions of Power, Atlantic, Indo-Pacific, and Historical Lessons. I'd also like to thank today's distinguished guests, Sir John Saws, James Schoff, and Arna Westad for taking the time to speak with us today. So before we begin, I just have a few quick housekeeping items. So we'll be having a Q&A session at the conclusion of today's brief. So during the presentation or during the Q&A, please feel free to submit your questions through ZoomGov's chat function. It's a chat icon at the bottom of your screen. Also, go ahead and submit all of your questions today to Ms. Mariah Yeager. Her name should be listed as questions-Mariah Yeager. Questions that aren't submitted to Mariah specifically may not be addressed, so please make sure to send your questions to Mariah. Also note that your name is going to appear in the chat before your question, and it'll be read out loud before we address that question. If you prefer for your name to not be recorded and on the record, go ahead and rename yourself by going to participants at the bottom bar of your screen, then more next to your name, and finally rename. So now I'm going to turn the floor over to Professor Richard Allington from the UK Ministry of Defence for a brief introduction. So Richard, over to you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Nicole. So my name's Richard Allington. I work for the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory, and we are effectively the science and technology branch of the UK Ministry of Defence. This is the latest talk we have in this joint MOD-DOD series. And one of the reasons we work with Todd and his team on this is to broaden our perspectives from our science and technology focus and understand all of the strategic environment that you get by working with some fantastic speakers like we are today. The reason we focused on our topic, strategic advantage, for this theme is purely from a UK perspective, that a lot of the narrative from our high-level direction and documents which have been coming out from government in the last few months have used this term, focusing either on things like science and technology strategy, defence's integrating operating concept, or driving publications such as the Integrated Review of Security, Defence, Development and Foreign Policy. And if you're interested in those topics further, you can find them all freely available at www.gov.uk to find a UK perspective on those. But I mentioned we're interested in that strategic context, looking at it through multiple perspectives. Last week, we focused on the military angle. Today, we're thrilled to have three world-class experts to learn from their expertise about diplomacy, international relations, and foreign policy. So without further ado, let me hand over to Mr. Todd Vasey from the SMA program to introduce our speakers and the theme for the day. Over to you, Todd.
Well, thank you so much, Richard, and thanks for all that are tuning in many time zones around the world. We're grateful for your participation. As Richard said, this has been a great speaker series as the ones we have combined with our friends in the UK in the past. And today, as the title suggests, we are going to be focusing on alliances as we look at the emerging strategic doctrine coming out of both of our nations. Increasingly and correctly, it is focused on the power of these alliances and relationships. And there's a lot that we can learn from historical examples. These venerable alliances, institutions that have frankly set the course for Western democracies and what we would consider the rules-based world order. But the world is changing very rapidly, and these alliances, in some cases, are under strain, structurally and otherwise. So we can see reimagining, and we also see sort of ad hoc relationships emerging throughout the world, and that will be, I think, the case going forward. So we're going to hear from these wonderful speakers today. And try to learn about how to make this successful, both from a historical perspective and then advancing that a bit into some foresight. So with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator today, Dr. Nick.
Great, brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody. So the first thing to say is that obviously everybody now agrees, or seems to agree, that alliances are important, that alliances are central to generate strategic advantage in the world as it is now. But alliances aren't always easy. And I think that what we're hoping to do today is to see how we can leverage alliances, but at the same time avoid obvious pitfalls. So to give you an example, if you think about even very close alliances such as the alliance between the United Kingdom and the United States, or between the United States and Japan, in both cases there are very strong security relationships, but there are also inevitably going to be areas of economic tension and economic competition, for example. So how do you manage alliances across multiple different dimensions of the relationship? So today, we're going to think about this with really, as has already been said, three brilliant speakers. And what we're going to try and do is look at alliances, first of all, in a transatlantic setting. So Sir John Sawyers will first speak to alliances, thinking particularly in transatlantic setting. So he was the former head of MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service, for a number of years in the United Kingdom, was also the UK's ambassador to the United Nations, and has held a number of other senior roles. So after we've thought about alliances in a transatlantic setting, then we're going to move on to Jim Schoff. So Jim Schoff was in the Office of Secretary of Defense in the US during the Obama years, working on US-Japan and US-ROK relationships, and has had a long career and is now at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. And then the third perspective will be Professor Anna Westad from Yale. So Professor Westad has written 16 books, so clearly a diverse set of subjects. But really, certainly the reason I know of his work and the work that that has really influenced me, I've thought about things, is his work on the Cold War and thinking about a global Cold War. So can we look back? We're not in a new Cold War. It's not going to be identical to the Cold War, in the new sort of era of competition we're in. But can we look back and learn some lessons from how to make alliances work well and avoid pitfalls in alliances from the last notable competition that Western countries were involved in? So that is the trajectory of today. Sir John, then Jim Schoff, and then Anna Westad, and then we will go to questions. So please do think of questions and send them in during their talks. And we have a good amount of time for questions. So now over to Sir John.
Nick, thank you very much, and thank you, Richard and Todd, for inviting me to join you all today. Alliances have been sort of deeply ingrained in the lives of those of my generation, because we grew up in the Cold War. Our early years in public service were in the Cold War, and we saw the adaptation of NATO, often described as the most successful alliance in history, during the course of the 1990s, and some strains that have entered into the alliance more recently. And NATO is not the only alliance. We've been involved in other defense arrangements, the Five Powers defense arrangements in Southeast Asia, for example, providing for the defense of Malaysia and Singapore. We have very close defense ties with countries like Oman, which are short of an alliance, but are a partnership, which means that we would certainly come to a partner's assistance if they were ever under attack when the partnership is that close. And as Chief of MI6, of course, I was closely involved with the Five Eyes arrangement between the United States, Canada, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, which was more a partnership than an alliance. It was a partnership often described as an intelligence sharing partnership. Actually, it was an intelligence production partnership, and I'll be reflecting a little bit on the role that the Five Eyes has played and what we might draw from it. But when I look back, let's start focusing, as Nick, you suggested, on the Atlantic dimension and what made NATO so successful. Well, I think the first issue, first question, which is relevant to all alliances, is that NATO had a very clear purpose. It was set up to defend the democratic countries of Europe from the Soviet Union and Soviet expansionism. And we stuck to that through the 40 years between the formation of the alliance in 1949 and the end of the Cold War in 1989 or 1991, depending on what date you prefer to choose. And, and that having that very clear purpose, often joked about in the early years as keeping the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. We all know that little triptych. And it was sort of summed up in some ways really what NATO was about. It was trying to make sure that NATO, that the United States, a traditionally rather inward-looking and isolationist country for the first couple of hundred years of its existence, became committed and locked in to the defense of Europe, which it called on it in warfare twice earlier in the century. And the other second dimension, I would say, after clarity of purpose, is the level of trust and reliability that members of the alliance have in one another. And this in particular was the trust that European countries had in the American commitments to be at war if a European country was attacked by the Soviets or by the Warsaw Pact. Now, obviously, the NATO agreement didn't go so far as to be automatically at war. It was to Article 5 stop short of that. It was immediate support as judged by each country. But nonetheless, it was a commitment which was very clear, very strong, and which the Russians also believed, and that was an essential part of it as well. And that reliability, dependability, demonstrated at crucial moments like the Berlin airlift, during the crisis of the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, and other occasions during the Cold War, with not just political demonstrations, but military exercising and so on, I think helped demonstrate the cohesion of the alliance. And that sense of trust was absolutely central. And it was helped, of course, by having a common enemy. There's nothing like having trust in one another if the alternative is to be steamrolled by the opposition. In a sense, one of the difficulties that NATO has had since the end of the Cold War is it hasn't had that clarity of opposition, of enemy. I think the third thing I would say is crucial in an alliance is that different countries, different members of the alliance bring different qualities, and inevitably not everybody is equal. And we've been fortunate in the NATO alliance to have had the leadership of the United States, but leadership requires followership. And during the Cold War, what defined that, I think, was that the lesser powers had to do what they could to contribute, and the greater powers had to listen to the concerns of the smaller powers and take them into account in their decisions. The issue of burden sharing, I first recall burden sharing coming up during the Reagan administration whilst the Cold War was still underway, where it was felt that the European powers were perhaps not doing as much for their own defense as they should, and too much was being dependent upon the United States. And that, of course, is an issue which got worse during the 1990s when some major European NATO members found their defense spending falling even below 1% of GDP. Which was frankly inadequate. But that sense of relationship between leadership and followership, there was a good example of it, which I witnessed personally in the early 1990s after the Cold War was over, when Britain and France and one or two other European countries had forces in Bosnia, and the Clinton administration was elected on with a policy of lift and strike, lift the arms embargo and strike the Serbs. And of course, we and the French in particular had troops on the ground. And I remember Warren Christopher coming over and consulting with first Britain and then France and then other NATO allies, and getting a very strong level of concern about the new Clinton administration policy, so much so that they never implemented it. And that was a good example of the leader of the alliance listening to the smaller members and the members which had a more exposed position than the United States did, and acting accordingly. Some would say that the recent experience this year with Afghanistan was a case where there was consultation, there was widespread consultation between the United States and European allies about withdrawing from Afghanistan. But on this occasion, the widespread concerns and preferences for European countries to remain with a modest level of forces in Afghanistan was not upheld. So I think those three qualities of purpose, trust, and leadership, followership, relationship. I think those are the three qualities of a successful alliance. And Nick, you talked about managing competition, managing innovation. I think it's really important, especially amongst Western countries, where diversity and economic competition is ingrained in our DNA. And I do think that the diversity of equipment that we use, whilst we wanted it to be interoperable across the alliance, it was also important that that diversity created some uncertainty for our opposition. And at the highest level, the Soviets had a lot more difficulty developing their own nuclear doctrine, because there were three Western nuclear powers, not just one. And a defense doctrine might do for all three. But if you ever wanted to get onto the front foot and use nuclear powers and nuclear weapons aggressively, well, you had three major powers to consider, not just one. So that diversity, I think is important. And the Five Eyes was a rather different partnership. That too had its origins in the Second World War, where the level of engagement, mutual reliance, and trust was very profound and very deep. And when I look at purpose, trust, and leadership in the context of the Five Eyes, the purpose there is very clear. Purpose is to maximize intelligence production on a global basis, share the burden between them, and share the product between them as well. And although the United States is 100 times larger than New Zealand, nonetheless, the United States depended upon New Zealand for certain categories of intelligence collection, as the United States did on the UK, Australia, and Canada. Of course, it's an imbalanced relationship. The middle-sized and smaller members of the Five Eyes gained proportionately more than they've contributed, but nonetheless, there was that common purpose of what we were trying to do, and a level of trust that only really comes from having a common culture and having a common experience, I think, in warfare, which develops that degree of trust. Now, Jim's going to talk about Asia Pacific, but at risk of treading on his territory a little bit, let me just say, how do I think of these Atlantic lessons transport themselves into the Asian environment? Because clearly we still have a challenge of dealing with Russia, still a major power, still a major source of threat to Western countries, but we also now have a different sort of competition from a rising great power, which is an economic power as well as a gradually strengthening military power. And the first thing to say, I think, is the alliances in Asia are going to be looser. We're not going to have the Asian continent divided down the middle, one side aligned with the United States and the other side aligned with China. It's going to be much more flexible than that. And there are going to be a lot more Austrias and Finlands in the Asia context, who basically want to lean one way culturally and politically, but are dependent for other reasons on the other side, and will want to hedge their bets. And I think we'll see a lot more of that ambiguity in Asia, and for understandable reasons. And there'll be different clubs as well. We see the Quad of United States, Japan, India, and Australia evolving. We're seeing some harder-edged military commitments being built up. And Jim, I'm sure we'll talk about the relationship with Japan and South Korea. We had a very interesting little media storm this summer over the Australian submarine deal, where I think the Australians made the right strategic choice. And I think there's a possibility over the next 3 or 4 decades that Australia could play the sort of military role in the Indo-Pacific that the UK played in the North Atlantic during the Cold War, of being a highly dependable, trusted ally, patrolling some of the sea lanes and monitoring what Chinese submarines are doing in that vicinity. Of course, the diplomacy could have been better handled, but if you want to be able to stand up to China, you've got to be allied with a country that China really respects. And with all respect to our French friends, that meant the United States, not France. So I think the AUKUS is an interesting, important dimension. Now, I could talk about cyber, technology, intelligence. Maybe we'll get onto those in questions. But my last thought is that I think the Asia theatre may well look a bit more like Europe post-1815 than it does Europe post-1949. I think, and the Congress of Vienna was an arrangement where there are 6 or 7 powers, not 2 major ones, but there was a sort of a balance between them. And some of the larger powers, the UK included, could step in if that balance went out of kilter. And that sort of slightly messier arrangement between powers which are more equal with one another, as the US and China will be, I think will be we may learn more from that than we would from thinking that we should replicate NATO in the Asia sphere, which I don't think will work. With those thoughts, Nick, I'll hand it back to you.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And so, Jim, I hope you can forgive Sir John for stepping on your toes. Over to you.
Of course, of course. Thank you, Nick, and it's a pleasure to be with you all. As Nick said, I have experience both with Korea and Japan and the U.S. alliance relationships, but more with Japan, and so I'll focus my opening remarks primarily on that. But we can talk about Korea situations, circumstances as well later on. So overall, my impression is that some of the traditional challenges with alliances are more pronounced with partners in Asia compared to Europe. Certainly the rise of China, Sir John alluded to, has made concerns about entanglement versus abandonment more pronounced. North Korea's nuclear advances have complicated things as well. Communication is frequently more difficult culturally and linguistically. Budgeting and regulatory systems are less compatible. And there's a greater sense of direct competition in the commercial arena, I think, with both Japan and Korea. Still, we have many shared interests, similar values, and we have a long history of working together. So a few years ago, I did some research on alliances in the private sector that stuck with me on what makes strategic alliances function well and endure. In the private sector, we see corporate alliances all the time. There are agreements between firms to do business together in ways that go beyond normal company-to-company dealings, but still short of a merger. There are often competitors in other markets, each with different operating styles and business cultures. These alliances are difficult to make successful, and the failure rate is more than 50% by some measures. And they can fail for various reasons, including insufficient commitment by senior management or poor communication. But an underlying cause, and this dovetails with Sir John's comment as well, an underlying cause is the failure to grasp and articulate their strategic intent, or in other words, the lack of a recognition of a close relationship between the overall strategy of the company and the role of the alliance in that strategy. And this, I believe, is the fundamental challenge for US-Japan and US-South Korea alliances today if we want to sustain them. At both a macro and micro level, we need to rethink and agree upon how our alliance helps each country's national strategy, and then explain it within the government and to the public. Elements of the old grand bargain still remain: subsidized US military presence in Asia in exchange for regional stability and open markets, but the strategic environment keeps evolving. Recent US-Japan leadership summit joint statements describe our key goals as strengthening and modernizing our security alliance on the one hand, and promoting peace, stability, and economic growth throughout the world on the other. And now we are increasingly combining the technology, economic, and security components. We have a pretty good roadmap for the first objective on security cooperation in the Japan case with the revised defense guidelines from 2015, but we have barely coordinated our activities for the other objectives in as structured a way. So today I'll talk a little bit about science and technology collaboration in the US-Japan alliance. They have a long history starting in the mid-1960s with work on natural sciences and medical sciences and expanded to nearly every field. The political and foreign policy backdrop or context for this collaboration has evolved, ebbing and flowing in terms of perceived priority and opportunity. But I think it's fair to say that we have never seen the kind of bilateral alignment that exists today in terms of policymaker interest in science and technology, a widely perceived need for foreign collaboration, specific areas of research focus, and the overall goals of that collaboration. And I'd pick three main goals: mitigating climate change or its impact, number two, being able to control pandemics, and third, staying ahead of China in a wide range of critical technologies and scientific discovery. And this last objective is arguably the most pertinent in a bilateral context because more open multilateral engagement is available for the first two. So the case for US science and technology collaboration with Japan is clear. Japan is the world's third largest investor in research and development behind the United States and China. Japanese companies fund more research and development in the United States than any other country's firms. Japan is also the third most prolific patent filer in the world behind China and the United States. Pooling resources, data, and talent would benefit both allies. So the question is not whether bilateral science and technology collaboration is a shared strategic opportunity, but rather how to keep it, how to adapt it to keep up with new geopolitical realities and the rate of technological change. So I have a few slides I wanted to share. That's okay. Let's see if I could do this effectively. Gotta hit the share button. And start the, okay, this will go relatively quickly. First, I wanted to talk about alliance management. So this is a sketch of how the US and Japan handle things generally. We have a 2+2 process to coordinate the most important alliance issues related to foreign policy and security over on the right-hand side, my right-hand side. But for science and technology cooperation, for example, it's ministry to ministry, lab to lab, it's ad hoc and bottom up. And that's been fine in the previous environment, but I think we need something more coordinated strategically if we want to make greater gains and better use of our resources. We also need to make sure the steps we take to protect our economic security and promote innovation and competitiveness are compatible. The main vehicle for our collaboration is a 1988 agreement on science and technology cooperation drafted at the height of our economic competition. And it significantly limits flexibility regarding private sector and dual-use technology collaboration. Here's a quick look at how government research funding is distributed by ministry in Japan. You can see how the Ministry of Education, Science and Technology oversees most of the spending in the kind of the turquoise greenish color there, followed by METI in gray, the Economy, Trade and Industry Ministry. The recent growth in other is mostly due to increased allocations to the Environment Ministry. Now, if you compare to the US, you can see that there's no simple macro counterpart for MEXT, for the Education, Science, and Technology Ministry on this front. The biggest funder is Department of Defense and then Department of Energy. But there are various strong existing relationships between different subcomponents. So in the space field, NASA and JAXA, National Science Foundation, Japan Science and Technology Agency, Department of Energy, Japan Atomic Energy Agency, et cetera. And then US national labs have MOUs with some national universities in Japan. So there's a place from which we can build. Of course, it's important to note that the private sector is still the largest funder of research and development in both countries. Here I show it a little breakdown for the United States, but it's even more pronounced in Japan. And it's worth noting, if you look on the sidebar, that non-defense companies are the biggest investors. So hence the dual use dynamic makes it particularly important, but also challenging. And then my last comparison slide is to give a feel for how research is funded and conducted in Japan compared to the United States. The two flow charts are not the same scale, but you can see the percentages there. But I show it to highlight a couple of things. One is to show the relatively smaller role that the Japanese government funding plays in the national picture compared to the US. And another is how little Japanese government research funding goes to the business sector directly compared to the United States. Also, international contributions in Japan, or rest of world, is quite small. There's a concerted effort underway in Japan to expand the international component of its scientific endeavors. And this, again, provides another opportunity, I think. So let me go into, let me stop sharing because I want to talk. can get to this other piece later on. But I just wanted to mention a couple with the few minutes I have left, examples, real world examples that I ran into researching a working paper that we published just a couple months ago on US-Japan science and technology collaboration, particularly in the private sector. So I was interviewing Japanese companies who are funding research and development here in the United States, collaborating with universities and with other companies. And you see a variety of challenges or hurdles that are there. So you have all the big picture issues that we talked about, that Sir John talked about, and that I mentioned in the beginning about how to make alliances work, but you also need to have the compatibility that helps support the trust factor on information security, technology security, for example. So a Japanese company funding research, both in the United States and Japan, was making, this was in the quantum computing arena, was making important gains, wanted to share some of the research results from that took place in the United States and share it with the headquarters back in Japan. But that is export controlled research on the US side. And so even within the same firm, they were not able to share that information back. Arguably, if that information was able to go back and forth, you would be doubling the opportunity, the data pool, the test bed dynamic there, but there was no means to do that. Department of Energy had a big project on the use of AI and regulating artificial intelligence, regulating energy grid flows and with renewable energy out in California. A Japanese company was going to be a corporate partner with universities on this front. But then they ran into problems with the data set was being generated actual data from a huge public utility, private public utility in California, and the rules governing data privacy or how that data had to be handled by the state of California made it impossible for the Japanese company to participate. They would have had to invest all kinds of money to change around their computer systems, et cetera. So they bailed and decided not to participate in that. And we see the Defense Trade Advisory Board was looking to make it life easier for selling various subcomponents back and forth in joint defense equipment projects. And they were trying to include the Five Eyes countries plus Japan in that, but because Japan does not have a deemed export provision to better regulate how non-Japanese are hired into the company, there was incompatibility there. So they eventually just created the exemption for only the Five Eyes countries and not Japan. So Japan is trying to improve its economic security legislation and rules and regulations to be more compatible. Deemed export coverage, export controlled research, a classified patent system, a classified court and dispute resolution system. All of these things are important, but there's also a public relations element. I think Japan needs to make sure the Americans feel comfortable and understand not just that they've changed a few rules, but that I can really trust this Japanese company or this Japanese ministry or agency with my technology. There's still a kind of a reputation gap that needs to be overcome. So it's not just changing the rules, it's also making sure you've built up that kind of trust and appreciation for it. So I think I've run out of time, so I'll stop here, but we can get into more details later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. And now, so Anna Westad is a historian. It's written brilliant work on a global history of the Cold War, so integrating across Pacific and transatlantic perspectives. And so it will be fantastic to hear from you.
Thank you, Nick. And thank you to you and to your colleagues for putting this discussion together. I've been fascinated by what my co-presenters have come up with already. And I'll try not to do too much revisiting of the very important points that they have outlined, but there will be a little bit of overlap. The good thing is that it allows me to be relatively brief, and then we can get back to some of these issues in the discussion. So as you said, Nick, I come to this from an historian's perspective. And I think when we look at the situation today, that might be a particularly important perspective, because we need to understand the different backgrounds that go into different parts of the world, an ever-expanding world in international affairs terms. I think in order to understand at least some of the points of view that you see represented today, which will, in my view, crucially inform alliance making and international friendships in the future. So just with regard to the Atlantic world, it is important, I think, to point out that there are really very different traditions in terms of alliances and alliance making between Britain, Europe, and the United States. So in Europe, to some extent, including Britain, alliances, of course, are a very old phenomenon. And overall, if you think about this over the last 500 years or so, what alliances have done is to provide power to the less powerful and to deter attack by mighty enemies. I mean, there have been examples of aggressive alliances as well, but overall, I think that is a significant part, but not an exclusive part, of the European experience. For the United States, of course, the background is almost entirely different. The founding fathers were warning against entangling alliances with other countries. And there's always been, I think right up to today, on the current in American politics, that is not isolationist. I mean, that's a term I do not like. I don't think the United States at any point in its history has really been isolationist in a sort of basic form, but is skeptical towards formal alliances that go beyond very specific purposes. I think that was also true to some extent for the Cold War, which I will return to later on. But it is important to understand these very different backgrounds in terms of alliances and alliance making, because they do inform some of the political perspectives that are important to understand today. Now, the European alliance idea, as it had developed, not least in the 19th century, came crashing down before and, of course, during the First World War. And a lot of people in different places, not least here in the United States, but also in Europe, blamed alliances for the war. One summing up in the interwar era was that it was the alliances that had produced the war. And therefore, alliances was something one had to approach with a great deal of caution, because they might produce the opposite results of what one was looking for in terms of security and stability. Now, I always find it interesting when we think about our own time, that the biggest challenge, in a way, in terms of handling alliances before 1914 was for a rising Germany, which was allied to a decaying empire next door. And for decision makers in Beijing, I spent quite a bit of time working on and with China, their alliance, pseudo-alliance with Russia, is to some extent in that category, and therefore should set off some warning bells in terms of where China goes next. So alliance is not only a problem in terms of those who are the predominant or the status quo powers within an international system. They may be equally, or if not more, problematic for rising powers as they plot their next steps. So John said, entirely correctly, that NATO is the most successful alliance in the history of alliances. And John, you have the historian's vote of confidence on that one. I think that is undoubtedly true. It's certainly true when it comes to more complex alliances, but I think it's true for alliances in general, if we look at them within a very long time perspective. So it is therefore crucial, and I'll spend most of the rest of my time doing this, that we try to understand what NATO did right during the Cold War era and what was more problematic. Because it's not just an issue of what went right, and there was a significant degree of assistance by other institutions, and not a low level of luck that also played in with regard to this. But there were more problematic aspects of NATO, even during the Cold War era, in spite of its successes. So what it did right is easy to sum up, and we've touched upon it already. It provided effective, believable security for its members, and particularly for the smaller member nations of NATO. It was able to come forward with a set of tenets in terms of how alliances should be organized, politically as much as militarily and strategically, that worked for more than a generation. And that in itself is quite unique. There was also, as has already been pointed out, a significant element of give and take within the alliance. And without that, and I think this is one of the bigger lessons from history, no alliance, no friendship, no international understanding will last very long. If there is one part that is simply a provider of security and another part or partners that are the receivers of security, these alliances usually are not very long-lived. And then finally, and to me crucially, just like it is for John Soros, it concentrated on its central mission. It had a clear understanding of what its mission was, and it had clear limitations in terms of what it was trying to do and what it was trying to achieve. So I think that's the most significant successes of NATO during time dealing with this. Were a set of issues that were difficult to deal with, I think, even under the best circumstances, but more difficult to deal with in a very rapidly changing world, as we saw after the Second World War. The first one was to integrate rising powers. So it's pretty clear that NATO was able to do this, and it was able to survive even when it had to integrate a newly formed and increasingly strong West Germany into the alliance. But it had problems doing so, as everyone who's looked at this historically will be aware. And it's pretty clear to me that if it hadn't been for the expansion of economic cooperation in Europe, which dealt with other aspects of the integration process, I think the integration of West Germany into NATO would have been very difficult indeed, along a whole set of issues, including strategic weapons. Then secondly, the issue of financial burden sharing that we have already touched upon. Without doubt, this was difficult. It became more difficult during the life of the alliance, but it was difficult from fairly early on. And if it hadn't been for the outside pressure provided by the Soviet Union and its allies, I think this would have become a much more difficult issue in NATO earlier on than the 1980s, when it actually came to the fore. So again, there was an element of luck in this, but there was also an element in terms of what the threat actually was and the immediacy of the threat as it was understood in Western Europe, first and foremost. And then finally, the issue of how to deal with out-of-area challenges, which I found that NATO, even during its Cold War heyday, was less than successful in handling. During the decolonization period, for instance, where I think a lot of issues were left unresolved with very negative international effects in the longer run, but also later on, as the world started to come up with new challenges and the Cold War, even before the collapse of the Soviet Union, started to recede as the one and only central conflict in the world. I think NATO had, even at that point, greater difficulties with handling these out-of-area challenges than what one should have foreseen that a very successful alliance in its core area would be able to do. And as I've indicated already in my emphasis on concentrating on its central mission, I think some of the difficulties was in the expansion of some of NATO's aims that were there already before the Cold War ended. So I'll conclude, Nick, just with a few lessons as I see them coming out of this for what we need to do today. I mean, the first one is very obvious. The need for not one size fits all in terms of alliances, as has already been pointed out, but for multiple alliances and other security arrangements to deal with what is the central security challenge of our times, which is the rise of China. Without looking at this well beyond the established alliance that exists today, even well beyond the friendships that exist today, I think it will be almost impossible to deal with the challenge that China represents. And Asia, of course, is particularly important with regard to this. And I wholeheartedly agree with what John said earlier on, that it is in many ways, if there is a historical parallel, the parallel for this is not to the Cold War. And I've written about this quite extensively. If it is to anything, it is to the 19th century. And I think we should spend a lot more time to discuss that in terms of how we deal with multipolarity, which is what we will find certainly in a broad sense in Asia. I think also on a global scale, to a much higher extent than what we saw in the during the Cold War, which was quite uniquely in historical terms a bipolar international system. So the multiple approaches to this, the different approaches to how to deal with this through different organizations, institutions, and friendship, I think is the key for this, particularly with regard to Asia. I think also, of course, we need to be ready for security compromises with other powers, including China. And that's indeed a lesson from the Cold War, that, you know, the success of Allied strategy during the Cold War consisted not just in effective deterrence and being able to deal with different aspects of the Soviet threat. It also was represented by being able, when it was possible, to strike compromises, even with the Soviet Union. Think of the détente era, which to my mind was central for securing a peaceful end to the Cold War when that became possible. And one has to construct alliances and friendships with like-minded partners in ways that make these kinds of compromises possible. That's not easy to do, but it certainly is a challenge we have to take seriously. And then finally, have a much more holistic approach. I mean, both of the previous speakers have pointed this out. A much more holistic approach to security than what we've had in the past. And this is already happening, of course, both in Britain and the United States and further afield. We have to look at economic and technological interests as much as straightforward security interests. We have to think about issues that are related to climate change and to pandemics. In many ways, it's on these issues, the issues that are immediately on the side of the narrower strategic considerations, where we got most lucky during the Cold War, that we were able to, through other instruments, to deal with at least some of these challenges, while leaving the core alliance, the core Western alliance, the NATO alliance, to focus on security issues. It's quite possible that we will not be as lucky as that in the next phase of international tension. And that's the reason why we have to start thinking now about how we deal with those other issues as part of the international strategic picture. And it's only if we can be successful in a more holistic approach, not necessarily through alliances or by alliances, but by a much more comprehensive understanding of security, that we will be able to develop within the narrower security issues the kind of alliances and friendships that we need. So that's what I had to say, Nick. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I mean, I guess sort of I could tie it all together by saying, you know, that there are clearly common themes in what you were talking about in terms of particularly a core challenge. So taking that as a first question, there are if the core challenge, for example, is surrounding the rise of China, and that's, you know, one of the key historical trends of the moment, of this coming epoch, that challenge is simply seen very differently in different parts of the world. So how does one manage alliances on a global scale, you know, given that challenge is simply not seen the same way, you know, in very different parts of the globe?
Who are you asking?
Anybody.
Well, I'll have a first crack at that, but I think Arne will have an interesting historical perspective, and Jim as well. I think the first thing to do, Nick, is to beware the trap that Arne highlighted of thinking that the next major strategic competition is going to be like the last one. It's really important that we try and think afresh about China. That one of the questions in the chat talks about, you know, defining China as a common enemy. I'm not quite sure that's really where we want to get to, because if you do define China as a common enemy, you end up back in an old Cold War type scenario of blocks and everything else. And I think we have to live with a greater degree of ambiguity here, not least because so many countries are dependent economically on China. Now, some like Australia can be robust about this and recognize that their political, cultural, democratic, judicial dependence are all with the West, even if their economic and commercial dependencies are with China. But many other countries will find it much more difficult to do that. Indonesia, for example, is one. South Korea is another. Jim didn't mention South Korea at any length, but South Korea is highly dependent upon China and also has a highly problematic neighbor to its north, which only China can exert some influence over. So this greater complexity means that the United States, as the I'm afraid America is condemned to be the leader of this international alliance, is going to have to exercise a degree of skill and careful management so that the economic interests and national interests generally of the key players in this competition are respected and taken into account. That we can't expect an automaticity as there was in the NATO arrangement during the Cold War. India is a classic example here. India is the second, probably the third biggest power in Asia. It has traditionally been non-aligned ever since 1947, founder of the non-aligned movement, has had long-standing historical links with Russia, has had very close commercial links with China, but it equally is becoming increasingly interested in the Quad as a set of partners to help manage some of these other dependencies. So we shouldn't over-expect from India. We shouldn't expect India to be like Australia or even like Japan in terms of its willingness. There's going to be a gradation of depths of partnership. And when you look at the European contribution in the Asian arena, equally, you've got a country like Germany, which depends very heavily in export terms on the Chinese market, has established a very strong position there, which others can only envy at one level. And we can't expect Germany suddenly to flip and become hostile to China. We're going to have to find roles for the major European powers so that we are consistent with and complementary to an American strategy without necessarily being tied tightly in, willingly so, as we were during the Cold War. So I think that this management of uncertainty and ambiguity and difference is going to be a lot more demanding in this next phase than it was in the last.
Absolutely. And if I could add, I mean, I think part of the way that our policymakers are trying to address this challenge that Nick mentions is to articulate what the alliances are for rather than what they are against. And if you can create, whether it's the free and open Indo-Pacific or a rules-based international order as this goal that you're working towards that by its own design ultimately checks the biggest grievances that we have with a rising China that's using military and economic coercion, then that might be more successful. But there's a challenge there too, and I go back to how does the alliance fit with our own national strategy? If we can't agree domestically whether we want a rules-based international order in terms of trade rules or international treaties or other types of things, we have our own domestic challenge on that front, then it's harder to come together wholeheartedly to be pushing or promoting that particular outcome. I mean, I think overall we're moving in that direction, but the devil's in the details, and clearly whether it's the Trans-Pacific Partnership or other types of treaty obligations, the United States has more suspicions on that front.
If I can jump in just on the India issue, which I find increasingly interesting, and a lot of the people here at Yale who work on security issues now take an increasing interest in India and South Asia. And I think that is exactly one of those issues, one of those countries that we will have to deal with because it's essential in not just regional, but global security terms but we have to do so with a deep understanding of where India itself is coming from, as John said, with regard to this. And this is perhaps over the next generation, at least to me, the most important, but perhaps also the most difficult partnership and friendship relationship to manage, right? Because it has to be done in a way that understands where India's own traditions and background is coming from with regard to international affairs in general. But it's also very significant because we're actually dealing with an other rising power, right? We're dealing with a power that will be considerably more significant in its own right within, the next really half generation than what we are seeing today. And that's a different kind of issue than when we're dealing with our main partners in East Asia and when we're dealing with the Atlantic relationship. And I think, therefore, the sooner we get started, not just in terms of actually dealing with this, in terms of speaking to Indian friends or colleagues, but also for the United States and Britain to figure out what it actually wants India to do, what should be the substance of that kind of friendship going forward. That, I think, is of really, really great importance for the future.
Thank you very much. And please do keep sending your questions. We've got some great questions. So building a little bit on the issues of ambiguity, uncertainty in this sort of new era that have been discussed. That's if you're literally the former director of MI6, if you're a professor at Yale, if you've worked on for a long time in the Office of Secretary of Defense, then you guys are all happy with ambiguity and complexity in many ways. But I think Todd Vesey, the director of SMA, raises an important question. That may not be the case, with the broader, much broader trends in amongst publics. So Todd stresses, or asks, what is the role of global publics in the success of alliances? In historically successful alliances, the shared purpose seemed to go beyond an agreement beyond national governments to more of a, inverted commas, whole of society buy-in. In the information age, the societal division sown by targeted misinformation and disinformation activity seems to make this type of buy-in more elusive. Are we paying enough attention to this factor?
Yeah, I'll jump in first, if that's okay. I mean, clearly, and the Japan case is a good example of this. It is harder to do this. And we saw during the Trump administration, President Trump himself basically casting doubt on the reliability of the alliance and dismissing the contributions that Japan was making, demanding more. And there was also dismissing the benefits of some of the trade agreements that were signed. So there was a pushback to some extent through the business community, through nonprofit community. I mean, my foundation that I work at, Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA now, but even my previous job at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, people who understood the value of these alliance relationships and how they did support our own national security strategy and economic strategy, did whatever they could to articulate this. And I think polls have shown that message, eventually got through. But it takes a lot of effort and leadership attention to keep that up. And of course, you have to have the substance behind it to be able to make that argument. But it is a critical component for sure.
I also think one has to be very careful with this in terms of expecting too much of a whole society buy-in in order to create effective friendships and partnerships. I think one of the lessons, and this is also actually true for NATO, at least at its founding, one has to be willing to accept that, at least among some partner nations, there will be a great variety, substantial spectrum of political opinion with regard to the usefulness and even the appropriateness of a particular international partnership. So I think if we expect, and here I'm particularly talking about Asia, I mean, if we feel too hemmed in, we and people who are dealing with foreign policy and security issues in those nations, too hemmed in by always being pushed towards representing public opinion on all matters with regard to at least the origins of these kinds of friendships and understandings. I think we will simply, in the current situation, ham ourselves in too much. And if you flick this over to the Chinese side, I mean, one of the things that the current leadership in Beijing expects, indeed hopes for, is that there would be so much dissonance, for instance, with regard to Southeast Asia, which is a good example here, but it could be expanded even to South Korea and possibly Japan, that from the general public with regard to the links that exist with the United States, that it would make this overall security situation much more difficult to handle. And I think that doesn't represent the reality in most of these countries, but I am struck by how much of an increasingly strongly held perception that is, at least in some environments in Beijing.
Nothing to add.
I mean, thank you very much for enormous food for thought. So the next question is in some ways sort of pushing back a little bit against what both Anna and Sir John was saying, in what's the most appropriate model. And this is probably recognizing the fact that no model will be perfect. So this is from Corridon. Multiple people have suggested that the better model now for East Asia is the 1800 European model rather than the Cold War. But it seems that at present, and especially as we march towards the 2030s, there is a significant gap between America and Chinese capabilities versus those of the other great powers. And that seems more reminiscent of the Cold War than of the 19th century. Could you elaborate on why you think earlier Europe is a better model?
Well, I first raised this, and Arne will have some thoughts on it as well, from his own perspective. But my main point is that we shouldn't use NATO as and the Cold War as the paradigm for the future, the 21st century competition with China. We need to get out of our heads that this is going to be a block-to-block military rivalry where economic dimensions are much less important because each side is basically autarkic in its needs. The defining nature really of the China challenge is that we are hugely dependent on China for economic purposes, economic reasons, as well as having China as a major military and strategic competitor and rival. And we saw after the 2008 financial crash that the driver of global recovery was China. Now, that doesn't mean we owe anything to China for it, but it has put China in a position where Chinese production, Chinese skills, Chinese technology are going to be an important player, important component around the world, and for many countries as important as the United States, and for a lot of them more important. So there's a greater complexity here. And also, I don't think that, now others may disagree with this, but I don't think China has a strategic goal of global domination. I don't think it has an ideology that it is trying to impose on everyone else. The defining feature of China is to avoid a repeat of its 150 years of humiliation and to ensure that it is not dependent upon other countries in the way that for most of the last 2 centuries it has been. Obviously, the United States' position is rather different. It sees itself as the leading role in Asia, and the expansion of Chinese power pushes back that role. And we've got the flashpoint of Taiwan that we need to manage, which has cropped up elsewhere in the questions. But the reason why I think 19th century Europe might be a more interesting model, and it's completely imperfect, as all models are, for dealing with the 21st century problem, is this degree of mutual dependency amongst a range of players rather than a direct head-to-head military confrontation. And as Arne points to India as the classic example, I mentioned Indonesia, Jim has focused on Japan. These are not insignificant powers. The role that they're going to play in a future stable Asia, where there is a balance of power between them and each can defend their own interests without imposing on the other, I think is is the sort of way in which Europe actually for most of the 19th century successfully managed this, and there are exceptions, but most of that period we did actually manage that rivalry, and it finally broke down when Germany broke out of the constraints of that process, and frankly mistakes were made in a number of capitals in the run up to 1914. But I think it's not a bad model to have in mind, and frankly it is a better model than the bloc-to-bloc NATO Warsaw Pact competition.
I agree with that 100%. I think it's also, to be even blunter about it, it's a good model because it is a model that fits in, not in all respects, but in most respects, the kind of landscape that we see evolving at the moment. Now, this might change later on. As I said in my presentation, based on what we know today, I do not see greater bipolarity, even on a global scale. I see greater multipolarity evolving, although it will take time, and there will be a period in which the United States and to some extent China will be predominant in ways that other powers cannot achieve. But that's not the trend. That's not the direction, it seems to me, that things are taking overall. And then just one more point, building on John's outline, which I entirely agree with. We do have to put quite a bit of emphasis, of course, on how the 19th century multipolar system ended, and it did not end well. Right? Now, it's wrong to blame almost 100 years of stability simply, by saying this is how it ended up in 1914. But in the last generation of that particular form of multipolarity, there were forms of rivalry that were developing that unfortunately also do remind me of some of the rivalries that are developing today. And particularly, and this might be especially relevant for John, the gradual receding of overall British predominance, and Britain as being a stabilizer at the center of that system. Not a global hegemon in the same form as the United States has been since 1945, but still the ultimate stabilizer of a system that it had a great deal of responsibility for creating. And just like Britain's role in playing that stabilizing position receded at the very end of the 19th century, I think it's possible to see, at least over the past 6 years or so, that the US role is receding on a set of issues, not on everything, but on a set of issues, not least with regard to Asia. And those are effects of a changing international setting that we have to take seriously. Because after all, that was how the long piece of the 19th century ended up, and it ended very badly.
I agree with that. I think the parallel with today is that Britain around the turn of the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, wasn't in absolute decline, far from it. We were continuing to get richer and more powerful on our own. But the gap between Britain and other powers was narrowing, and to the extent where Germany became an equivalent power. Now, that is quite a parallel to where we are now with the United States and China.
Thanks. So the next question is from Steve Schinkel, and I think it's a good one because we've been sort of focusing on our alliances, as it were. But obviously, a lot of history is about, as you just said, relative things. So, so looking at Russia and China. This is from Steve Schinkel. This question is discussed a lot, but there is increased cooperation between China and Russia in security cooperation. Do you see an increased alignment between the two, even if not a, in inverted commas, formal alliance, but limited in scope to counter the US? Or do you see this as much ado about nothing?
It's certainly more than much ado about nothing. I mean, it is the closest relationship between the largest country in the world and still, well, I think barely now the most populous country in the world that we haven't seen, for a very, very long time. And probably even closer, I think many analysts would say now, and even what the situation was for most of the Sino-Soviet alliance back in the 1950s. So of course one has to take this very, very seriously. There is a sort of lack of balance in the relationship, which makes me think that this is not destined to go on forever, or even not necessarily for another half generation or so, which tends to be how I think about change in chronological terms. but I think there will have to be some kind of shock to the relationship for it to break down from the kind of level that it's at now. The problem here, and the problem with this arrangement is entirely, as I see it on the Russian side, is that the Russian leadership under Putin is so preoccupied with showing its disagreement with how it is being treated by the West in their own view, that it's willing to give China not everything, but a lot of what the Chinese are asking for in the relationship, and the Chinese are willing to put up with the kind of relatively low levels from a Chinese perspective of instability that Russia produces that might not necessarily be in the Chinese interest. So that's the sort of glue at the moment. But that a relationship that is so unequal and so problematic in many areas where their interests touch each other is something that is going to go on for a very long time, that I still have trouble believing.
I was certainly our representative on the Security Council when we saw the Russian and Chinese working increasingly closely together on tactical terms, tactical matters. On matters relating to North Korea, Russia followed the Chinese lead. On matters relating to Iran, China followed the Russian lead. And increasingly they moved together. And as they both felt the West was moving, the aftermath of the Arab Spring, moving in a direction which was against what they saw as their sort of Westphalian principles of non-interference in other countries, they banded together more closely, but always on a tactical level. I think the interesting thing, as Stephen Schinkel points out, and which Anna has endorsed, is that this is moving up the level. I don't believe China and Russia will ever reach a formal alliance where they commit to going to war on behalf of the other, but there is a political identity here. And I think for Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, they are each other's most important allies and partners in the world. And it's moved from a tactical level to a more strategic level. And this is partly the experience, of course, of what I would describe as the rather excessive use of the United States sanctions against other countries, where those who become vulnerable to US pressure because they use the US dollar will band together to try and find alternatives to the US dollar. And now whether that's cryptocurrencies or whatever, the Chinese have backed away from that, whether it's a convertible yuan, well, the renminbi, it will only be an alternative when it is convertible, but the cost of making it convertible is just too great for the Chinese politically. So there are risks on this, but I do think they are looking for different ways of making their systems less exposed, both on the financial front and on the information front, being able to close down the global internet and have separate national internets, and sharing technology on this as well. So it is moving forward. I think there are limits to it. The one thing the Russians hate above all is being a junior partner. They cannot conceive of the concept really, but they are forced into being a junior partner in this particular partnership, and it makes them uncomfortable. But like Anna, I think this is an arrangement which will persist for some years to come, unless there is some unraveling of the current sort of arrangements globally because of major change in either Russia or China, or God forbid in the United States.
Brilliant. And so this is for Jim from Gerald Epstein. So export controlled does not mean export prohibited. So what barred the Japanese company from getting export licenses to transfer R&D from its US subsidiary to Japan? Was it the re-export controls?
Great. No, I'm glad he asked that question, because it'll give me a chance to clarify that particular case. The main problem in that case was the ambiguity behind it, because what happened was the Japanese company wanted to transfer the information. It was requested by the research team in Tokyo, but they passed it through their legal department here in the US and compliance department and said, do you think this is export controlled? and they didn't know. So they erred on the side of caution. So they said, we should check with the Commerce Department and make sure it's okay. So they did that. And as of the time my report was published, it was 7 months later. They hadn't received an answer. So it's possible that that will eventually be cleared and okayed, but I think it highlights the inadequacy of the system when you have, so we have now the US-Japan core partnership, competitiveness and resilience partnership announced by Biden and Suga when Prime Minister Suga visited. And it really puts top leadership behind this idea of expanding and deepening and enriching our science and technology cooperation. But that will only work if eventually we get down to the level of these and fix these different incompatibilities and details. So that's that specific case.
So one can think about those sort of security aspects, and then there's also technological aspects. And I'm trying to ask my own question, which is, so, you know, obviously the US was pushing for a free trade deal in the Asia Pacific to involve the United States, and that obviously the US then stepped away from that sort of, you know, a little over 4 or 5 years ago. So so if the US is building these relationships, and I totally buy everything you're saying about, you know, multiple different types of relationships and different overlapping groupings and so on, but will it be sufficient if it's just security and, for example, just technology, if the economic dimension is absent?
Well, I don't think it's, I think the short answer is no. I mean, I think the economic piece has to be a part of it, but that doesn't mean everything has to be completely lined up and intertwined. They just need to be compatible, I think, and at least rowing in the same direction. So I think it's clear that there are opportunities for us to collaborate on the science and technology arena. And there was another question in the chat about the government role. Should we be expanding the government role in research and development given the changes? I think there's an argument for greater government sponsored research and possibly some collaborative classified research. We're doing it a little bit with the UK right now in the BARI initiative on certain defense technologies. Japan would, I think, really like to do some collaborative work with the United States in areas of quantum information sciences and artificial intelligence, but we're not at that level or ability to do it. But ultimately, it's going to, the amount that we can increase government-sponsored research is going to be limited, and you want the private sector to be driving much of this. So it's about expanding the ecosystem, the innovation ecosystem, to include other countries and other companies, so that we're getting more value for our investment in the process. And I think that's where the opportunity lies. That can't be completely divorced from similar views about basic trade, digital trade rules, how data is handled, privacy issues, et cetera. So you need to keep working those issues, but you don't have to stop pursuing science and technology collaboration because the economic piece maybe not be completely there, but we still have these security concerns, and we know we want to be on the cutting edge of innovation in this regard. So I think there are opportunities there.
Great, and so another dimension is raised by a question from Anonymous. So, well, a series of dimensions. So you have talked about strategic alliances in history, as well as more recently on economic, military and security perspectives in China or Russia. However, what do the speakers think about our alliances with countries in areas like the Middle East, where we have some dependencies on them in resources, and they can also act as brokers for relationships across the region? However, we have different views on society, in particular sex, gender and cultural norms, and democracy. So how do we balance our morals and values versus alliances?
Well, shall I have a crack at that? I'm sure my colleagues have views as well. First of all, we don't have formal alliances in quite the same way with Middle Eastern countries. We're very close partners to them. I mentioned Oman. Obviously, we're partners with all the GCC countries, including Saudi Arabia, which in many ways is problematic. And we have close intelligence and military ties with Israel. But Israel has its own interests and has its own means of pursuing those interests. But we do all share a sort of common concern about the disruptive role of Iran. That doesn't mean there isn't a way of finding a calming relationship there, but certainly that is the biggest disruptive factor in the region. And there is a degree of great power rivalry as well. The way that China is expanding its interests into the region. I remember talking to one particular leader, national leader in the Gulf, who said that, this was some years ago, who said that in the past, we used to think that strategic balancing was between the United States, Britain, and France. Well, now the strategic balancing is between the West, between America, Europe, and China, and East Asia in general, because half our oil goes to East Asia. We've got to have strategic contacts with the East Asian countries. We've seen the last 3 American presidents, including the current one, trying to gradually sort of move away from dependence on the Middle East. But that means that the Middle East countries themselves will develop their own alliances. And I think it's important that we don't just leave them for partnerships with countries which, in democratic terms, they are more closely aligned with. The lack of democracy up and down the Gulf is more like Russia and China, although it's not as oppressive, of course, than it is like Europe and North America. So I think on these things, I have a hierarchy of these considerations. That your strategic stability is the most important question, and there the Middle East is really important to us because it's on Europe's neighborhood. We have NATO allies in Turkey, which is a player in the region. And we should and are quite right to project our concerns on human rights issues, on our views on how society should evolve. But that it would be, I think, an error if we elevated those concerns above the strategic level. And now that may sound a bit harsh, but it's a sort of Kissingerian realism, I think, rather than a rather fancy Jimmy Carter, let's put human rights first, which he didn't actually do in practice.
I'd comment on that one as well. So I think one of the lessons of the Cold War, and this has both sort of moral, ethical, and strategic implications, is that if one inflates perceived security needs and rivalries up to the point where one expands security interests so broadly that one is willing to strike any kind of compromise with regimes that do not honor even the more basic human or civil rights obligations, then one puts at risk much of the central concept that one wants to represent in the outside world, which then has a knock-on effect to the security interest that one tries to defend. So I think this goes back to the discussion we had right at the beginning. So I would not disagree that there are security interests in the Middle East that now are still so important, though they are probably diminishing in terms of their overall significance, that one needs to deal with regimes that have a really distasteful approach to human rights issues. But the problem is that if the rivalry now with China and with Russia increases, I think one has to be very careful with drawing that lesson from the Cold War and not inflating one's security interests and the rivalry needs up to the point that one strikes a whole deal of compromises and form relations with countries that we will find it very difficult in ordinary circumstances to defend having close relationships with.
And sorry, just to add to Arna's point, which I agree, if you're sitting in Europe, the Middle East and North Africa poses a different sort of threat to our society. It's not a Soviet-style military defense threat. It's not a China-style competitive technological threat. It's the threat of a combined a combination of a terrorism threat, which could be nurtured in some of these countries, and a migration threat. Stability in the Middle East is vitally important for Europe if we're not to see a repeat of what happened in 2015 when 1 million migrants came to Europe. And then that was followed up by waves of attacks in Paris and Brussels and elsewhere around the continent. European countries have very strong interest in the stability of the region. Now, I would argue that stability is also tightly linked into the consent of a regime from its people. But there are different ways of achieving that. And the Gulf states achieve consent in a different way from how European countries achieve consent for their leaders. I think the area will remain important for us.
So I think that there's time for one last question, and then we'll go to your concluding comments. You can each tell us something about the future, how things will be new or different, and not just. So I think we all agree, seemingly, that it's not going to be like Cold War. It's not going to be exactly like the 19th century Europe. There will be something new and different, even if it's a bit more like 19th century Europe. So I'm looking forward to that. But one last question before that. So this is from Lisa Aronson for Professor Westad. But please do jump in, the other two panelists. So Professor Westad, you mentioned we need to construct alliances and partnerships in ways that make security compromises possible. What does this mean for NATO's partnership with Ukraine? What message should NATO send aspiring members in the next strategic concept? More broadly, NATO now has 40 partner states around the world. How should NATO adapt its approach to global partnerships in the next strategic concept?
This is a very important issue, and it is a very difficult one. And what I would say, I mean, that the 2 points that need to be made, and they need to be made at the same time. I mean, one is the emphasis that and I think all three of us actually emphasized originally, that an alliance is only as strong as its central purpose. So the kind of ideas that are built into it, but also the kinds of limitations that are there in terms of its extension. And I think for NATO, this is a very important issue over the next half generation, is that it's not a given that from the alliance's own perspective, or indeed for international security, that the expansion going beyond the partnerships, I mean, into the area of what will be seen, though it's not always written on paper, as security guarantees, it is not given that that is the right way to go. And then the second part, with regard to how to handle this vis-a-vis possible compromises that might be struck with Russia or with China. So I think one has to be able to deal with this in two different ways. Ukraine is a really good example of this. There is absolutely no doubt that it's both the right thing to do, and it is in our overall strategic interest to work more closely with democratically elected governments in Ukraine in order to strengthen Ukraine's security, including vis-a-vis Russia. But it's also entirely correct, and I think many of my Ukrainian friends would agree with this, that in that process, that the West, including Western Europe and the United States, is able to reach out to Russia and to have a meaningful conversation with Russia with regard to the role that the West plays in Ukraine. Not always possible to do. It's incredibly hard, but without that, without some kind of meaningful consultation as we develop that relationship, I think the situation would be far worse, not just for the NATO allies, but for the Ukrainians as well.
I'm sorry to preclude any other comments on that. So I just want to give time for one last concluding comment. And I would just say, we're talking about alliances. This is one of the sort of absolutely central features of the recently published Interim National Security Strategic Guidance that came out this March. This is going to be central for the national security strategy that is being written right now, and there are people on the line who will be involved in writing that strategy. So can you give us something that you think is most important about alliances now?
Let me offer. Sorry, Arne, you go ahead.
We could do it in the opposite direction, I thought. So I'd go first on that one, and then we get the wisdom of my colleagues. So I would say of everything that we've talked about so far, the most important thing, both from a US perspective, but also further afield, to me, rests with the issue of the multiplicity of various arrangements that need to be set up with countries across the world, and maybe especially in Asia. So being able to be very flexible in terms of the approaches that are needed, I think, for instance, about Southeast Asia, which I think is going to be of crucial significance to international security over the next generation. And I think it was John who pointed out earlier on, entirely correctly, that one has to be very careful, be very cautious in approaching the kind of security arrangements and other arrangements that we want to put in place with countries in Southeast Asia, so that we do not offer what would be hard to accept. And that's sort of one of my big lessons from history with regard to NATO, is that what has to be on offer is for countries to be able to preserve their own independence and their own sovereignty, but based on their outlook on what that looks like. That's a critical experience, I think, of the NATO alliance. And the way we carry that further today with regard to Asia in particular is not by replicating NATO. It is by understanding the principle that what should be on offer is what the taker is actually interested in and capable of implementing.
Well, I guess if we go in reverse order, then I'm up next. But a couple of thoughts come to mind. First, Nick, you mentioned the drafting of a national security strategy. Alliances featured pretty heavily in the previous administration's national security strategy, but they didn't really act like it. And so having the strategy on paper and how you follow through is critical in my mind, having consistency there. So it's about being realistic as well, understanding how alliances, where they can be most useful to our strategy, and then following through to make them as effective as possible. That, I think, will generate success or examples of success that hopefully then the public and people will continue to hold on to and invest in those alliances because they deliver. We have lots of challenges. Political division in the United States, political division in Korea, means that when one party wins or changes, it can really shift the perception of the value of the alliance in that context. So that's a real challenge. And then the networking of alliances, which is, I think, going to be critical, more and more important, as has been discussed, where it's not a series of spokes and bilateral relationships, but a broader web. We see the problems between Japan and Korea today, and the limitations that builds. There's been this mini-lateral movement of the Quad and AUKUS and all of the above strategy in terms of trying to make this work. And it's going to take a lot of effort, but I think being realistic and prioritizing is key. So thank you.
My last thought, and thank you, Nick, and your colleagues for giving us this opportunity. But my last thought is technology. When we fought the Cold War, the technology was fairly consistent. We'd invented nuclear weapons at the beginning of it, and there wasn't really any significant technology leap forward during the course of the following 40-odd years. Yes, we got into missile defense in the 1980s, but that caused a lot of problems. But the technology was basically static during the Cold War. We've made a huge step change in the technology realm. And secondly, this is not going to stand still. Technology is going to be a huge dimension of this future competition, rivalry, strategic challenge from China. And we need, as allies, to get our thinking straight on things like autonomous weapons, on things like cyber. We've got no doctrine really on cyber. We don't have a common way of thinking about it. It's just a problem, and we deal with it in different ways. We need to think more constructively like that great generation who'd fought the war and then determined never to fight it again in the 40s and 50s, came up with doctrine on the most challenging issues. And we need it on space, we need it on autonomous weapons, we need it on cyber and a number of other areas. So that's a challenge for the new generation of academics that Anna is teaching, and that I hope will succeed, because without it, we will stumble forward and technology may become the basis on which a new war is fought, rather than how we save ourselves from a new war.
Brilliant closing remarks from all three of you. Thank you very much indeed. Todd, did you want to just say goodbye, or Richard?
Well, that was a tour de force. Thank you all for participating and all of your inputs. Really, really outstanding from the starting gate to the finish line. And the closing comments were spot on and very appropriate. Richard, thank you all.
No, that's super, thanks. And thanks again to all our speakers. That's been a fantastic discussion. And that's the whole purpose of why we put these on, really, so that we can get a range of perspectives on some of these broader issues, you know, and have a really challenging discussion and give the audience the opportunity to ask such good questions. So thank you very much once again.